Okay, so ready for a deep dive into some seriously wild stuff.
Always up for a wild ride. What are we tackling today?
We're diving into subversion and not the sneaking around stealing secrets kind of espionage. This is about political warfare, but on a whole other level.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So you provided this interview, right? A 1983 interview with a former KGB propagandist, Yuri Bezmenov.
Oh yeah, Bezmenov, that's a trip down the rabbit hole.
Tell me about it. He basically lays out subversion like it's this whole system, almost like a guidebook to dismantling a society from within. Seriously spooky stuff.
It is, and the thing is, Bezmenov presents it not as some spy thriller plot, but as a very real and very methodical process.
Exactly. But here's where it gets even weirder. He says that only a small percentage of what the KGB did was actually traditional espionage. Like, we're talking 10–15% max.
Yeah, Bezmenov was adamant about that.
So what was the other 85–90%?
He argues it was all about subversion, this much subtler long game. Instead of planting bombs, you plant ideas. Instead of blowing up bridges, you dismantle a society's willingness to fight for itself.
Okay, so less Mission Impossible, more like Inception.
Well, exactly. Bezmenov's point is that to really cripple a nation, you don't just steal secrets or take out key targets, you go after its core, its identity.
Okay, so how do you actually subvert an entire society?
Well, Bezmenov argues that it's not something you can just force on any society. He says the target nation has to be vulnerable to it in the first place.
Vulnerable how?
He uses Japan and the USSR as examples. Before the 20th century, Japan was this closed-off society, very resistant to outside influence.
So they weren't interested in being subverted even if someone tried.
Right. Same with the Soviet Union. They had closed borders, controlled what their citizens read and saw, and the KGB kept a tight lid on things. It made it incredibly difficult for external ideas, especially those that challenged the system, to gain a foothold.
So it's like a seed needing the right soil.
Exactly. If you try to plant it in concrete, it's not going to take root no matter how hard you try.
So what kind of soil makes a nation vulnerable to this subversion thing?
Bezmenov believed that societies that are open, those that encourage debate and have a free flow of information, while generally positive things, are actually the most susceptible to this kind of insidious manipulation.
Okay, so that's both fascinating and a little terrifying to think about.
Yeah.
So how does this subversion thing actually work? Does he lay out a playbook or something?
In a way, he does. Bezmenov outlines 4 stages: demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and normalization. And here's the kicker. He says this whole process can take decades to fully play out.
Decades. We're not talking about a quick coup or some kind of hostile takeover.
Not at all. This is like social engineering on a massive scale, played out over generations.
Okay, now that's just chilling. So how does it start?
It begins with demoralization. It's this slow, deliberate process. Bezmenov says it takes 15–20 years. And it's about targeting a nation's core institutions and values.
So what, like undermining the government, the economy, that sort of thing?
Well, he includes those, of course, but Bezmenov goes deeper. He specifically points to areas like religion, education, social life, power structures, even law enforcement.
Wow. So we're talking about the very fabric of a society. It's not just about politics or economics. It's about how people see the world, what they believe in.
Precisely. The goal is to create a population that doubts its values, its institutions, its very history. They lose faith in their leaders, in each other, in the systems that hold their society together.
Okay, so how do you actually demoralize an entire nation? What does that look like in practice? Give me some specifics.
Well, take religion, for example. Bezmenov talked about how you could weaken established faiths by promoting alternative spiritualities, New Age movements, anything to create a sense of doubt and pull people away from those shared traditional beliefs.
So it's about creating chaos in the spiritual realm, making people question their core beliefs.
Got it.
Yeah. What about education? How does that fit into this whole demoralization strategy?
Bezmenov believed that education systems were key. He argued that they could be infiltrated with ideologies that, in his words, distracted from constructive learning. So instead of a heavy emphasis on things like science, technology, engineering, math, the things that he argues actually build a strong society, you'd see a push towards what he saw as less practical areas of study.
Can you give me an example? What kind of less practical stuff?
He mentions things like the history of urban warfare or too much focus on sexuality. He saw these as distractions from what he considered more essential subjects.
Interesting. So it's about shifting priorities, making people question the very foundation of their knowledge. What else?
And it doesn't stop there. Bezmenov argues that even seemingly harmless things like social groups and traditions are targeted.
So he's talking about undermining things like community organizations, social clubs, even family structures. Seriously.
He was. He believed that strong communities, those united by shared values and traditions, were much harder to subvert.
So break down the community and you weaken the nation. I see where he's going with this. But how? How do you break down something as fundamental as family or community?
Bezmenov argued that it was about replacing those naturally formed bonds with more artificial ones.
Artificial bonds, like what?
Well, he was a product of the Soviet system, so he often pointed to things like government-sponsored youth groups or anything that shifted allegiance away from traditional structures and towards those controlled or influenced by, well, in his case, the state.
It's fascinating how he connects these seemingly small things, like what kids are doing after school, to this bigger, grand strategy of subversion.
That's Bezmenov, always looking for those deeper connections. And he takes it even further. He argues that this erosion of community and tradition ultimately weakens a nation's power structures, too.
Because if you don't trust your neighbor, you're certainly not going to trust someone in a position of authority, right?
Right. And that distrust, that suspicion, it creates the perfect breeding ground for the next stage destabilization.
Okay, things are getting serious now. We've got a society that's starting to question itself, its leaders, its very identity. What happens next?
Well, that's where we'll pick things up in part 2 of this deep dive.
Okay, so things are heating up. We're talking about destabilization now. This is where things get messy, right?
That's one way to put it. Remember how we talked about those seeds of demoralization being sown? Well, now it's time to turn up the heat.
So you're talking about actively pushing a society towards chaos.
In a way, yes. Bezmenov argued that during this destabilization phase, you exploit existing tensions, those cracks in the foundation that were already there.
And I'm guessing those sleepers we talked about earlier, they play a role here too.
Absolutely. They're activated, so to speak, but we'll get to them in a bit. First, you have to understand the mechanics of destabilization.
Okay, so lay it on me. How do you destabilize an entire nation?
Well, Bezmenov highlights a few key areas that are particularly vulnerable during this stage.
Hit me with them.
He talks about economics, labor relations, law and order, and of course the media. These are all pillars of a stable society, right?
Right. So the goal is to shake them until they crumble.
Exactly. And it's not about destroying them completely, at least not yet. It's about making them dysfunctional, making people lose faith in the systems that are supposed to govern their lives.
Okay, so let's take economics, for example. How do you destabilize an entire economy? We're not talking about a stock market crash, are we?
No, this is much more insidious. Bezmenov talks about deliberately radicalizing the relationship between employers and employees. Remember, we talked about how labor relations were targeted during that demoralization phase. Well, now things get kicked up a notch.
So instead of just a little grumbling, now you've got full-blown worker uprisings.
Precisely. Bezmenov suggests that compromise becomes impossible, leading to strikes, disruptions in essential services, things that have a real impact on people's daily lives.
He actually uses the example of garbage collectors going on strike.
He does, doesn't he? Seems like a small thing, right? But as Bezmenov points out, if the garbage isn't collected, cities can become overwhelmed, disease can spread, it creates a sense of chaos and disorder.
And suddenly, people are looking for someone to blame, someone to fix it.
You're getting it. And it's not just about economics, of course. Bezmenov argues that law and order is another key target during this stage.
What does he say about that? How do you destabilize something as fundamental as law and order?
It's about blurring the lines. Bezmenov suggests that criminals are portrayed sympathetically, while law enforcement is painted as corrupt, brutal, something to be feared rather than trusted.
Divide and conquer. Classic.
Exactly. You create a climate of fear and suspicion where people don't know who to trust or who to turn to. And this is where the media comes in.
I was just going to ask about that. It seems like they'd have a field day in all of this.
Oh, absolutely. Bezmenov saw the media as a primary weapon of subversion, especially during this destabilization phase.
Okay, so what's their role in all of this? Do they just report on the chaos, or are they actively fanning the flames?
Bezmenov argues that they become increasingly antagonistic towards traditional institutions and values.
Antagonistic how?
They challenge the narratives that have always held a society together. They promote voices of dissent, often amplifying those who are the most extreme or divisive. They position themselves in opposition to the established order.
So they're not just reporting the news, they're shaping it.
Exactly. They're creating a narrative of chaos and decline, which feeds into that sense of fear and uncertainty that's already brewing. And that's where those sleepers we talked about really come into play.
They've been waiting in the wings for this moment, haven't they?
Precisely. They emerge, often taking on positions of influence within those key areas we've been discussing: the media, education, even government.
So they're embedded within the system, ready to strike when the time is right.
Exactly. And that time, according to Bezmenov, is during the next stage crisis.
Okay, I think I'm getting a bad feeling about this.
Yeah, crisis is definitely the right word for it. This is where all that careful destabilization we talked about, it reaches its peak, the systems start to break down, and society is left reeling.
So it's a full-blown societal meltdown.
Pretty much. People are scared, they're angry, and they're looking for answers, and that's when those sleepers, they really make their move.
They seize the moment.
They do. They present themselves as having the solutions, as the only ones who can restore order. But their solutions often involve radical change, a complete overhaul of the existing power structures.
Sounds like a power grab disguised as a rescue mission.
You got it.
Yeah.
Bezmenov argues that there are two main scenarios that tend to play out during this crisis stage.
They am on me.
You either have a civil war, where different factions within society are fighting for control, or you have an invasion, where a foreign power exploits the chaos and steps in to restore order. Either way, the result is the same.
A nation brought to its knees, ripe for the taking.
Exactly. And that brings us to the final stage of Bezmenov's subversive playbook normalization.
Normalization. Sounds so benign almost.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing it's anything but.
You're right. It's the calm after the storm, but it's a manufactured calm, tightly controlled by those who orchestrated the chaos in the first place.
So a new order is established, built on the ruins of the old one. But what about those who helped build it? Those sleepers. Are they rewarded for their efforts?
Well, according to Bezmenov, often they're not. He says those who are no longer useful to the new regime are often eliminated.
Eliminated, you mean?
He doesn't mince words. He says they're deemed a threat to the very order they helped create and are dealt with accordingly.
Wow, talk about ruthless. It's like they're rewarded for their loyalty by being disposed of.
It's cold, but it makes sense from a certain perspective. These
Yeah.
revolutionaries, these activists, they know how to sow chaos, how to exploit weaknesses. That makes them dangerous to those in power.
The revolutionaries become a liability once the revolution is over. It's almost Shakespearean.
It really is, and it highlights the cynical reality of this whole subversive process, at least according to Bezmenov. It's not about ideology, it's about power.
So is there any hope? Is there any way to stop this subversion train once it gets rolling? Or are we all just doomed to be pawns in this game?
Well, Bezmenov does talk about ways to counter subversion, but he says the strategies change depending on how far along a nation is in this process. In the early stages, he believes that restricting certain freedoms can be somewhat effective.
Restricting freedoms, like what?
He talks about limiting the import of foreign propaganda, things like that, or, in his words, limiting the influence of those he considered hostile to the nation.
So like censorship, that seems a little extreme, doesn't it?
It does, and Bezmenov acknowledges that. He knew these kinds of measures wouldn't be popular, especially in societies that value things like freedom of speech.
It's a tough line to walk, trying to protect yourself from manipulation, while also safeguarding those very freedoms that make you who you are.
Exactly, and it gets even trickier when you talk about those later stages, once a nation is already in a state of crisis.
What does he suggest then? Is there any turning back at that point?
This is where Bezmenov gets really controversial. He argues that by the time a nation is in a full-blown crisis, only force can really reverse the process.
Force. He's talking about military action.
He is. He uses the example of the U.S. invasion of Grenada in 1983 to illustrate his point. He argued it was necessary to stop the subversion that was already happening there.
That's a pretty extreme example.
It is, but it shows how serious Bezmenov was about this threat. Whether or not you agree with his conclusions, his perspective definitely makes you think about the lengths a nation might go to protect itself.
It really does. So where does this leave us? I don't know about you, but this whole conversation has been a bit of a wild ride.
It has. Bezmenov's interview, whether you buy into it or not, it paints a pretty unsettling picture of how vulnerable our societies might be to manipulation.
It really does. And it makes you wonder, how do you protect yourselves against something like this?
Well, one thing Bezmenov stresses throughout this whole interview is the importance of self-awareness and critical thinking. He says those are really the best defenses against this kind of manipulation.
So don't just accept everything you hear at face value. Do your own research, question the narratives you're being fed.
Exactly. He even argues that something like strong religious faith can act as a shield against ideological subversion.
Interesting. So it's about having a strong internal compass, something to guide you through all the noise.
I think that's a great way to put it. Bezmenov is basically saying, don't be a passive consumer of information. Be skeptical, be discerning, and most importantly, think for yourself.
Words to live by in this day and age, for sure. Well, that was our deep dive into the world of subversion, as told by a former KGB propagandist. Whether you found it enlightening or terrifying, hopefully it's given you some things to ponder. Until next time, stay curious, and as always, thanks for listening.